The tape runs for 44 minutes and 18 seconds. It exists. You can find it. Researchers have transcribed it, journalists have analyzed it, historians have written about it. And yet there is one sentence in that recording, spoken not by Jim Jones, not by any of his lieutenants, but by a woman named Christine Miller approximately 11 minutes in, that almost no one ever quotes. Not because it isn't there, but because it is the one moment in those 44 minutes where everything that was about to happen could have gone differently. And the reason it didn't go differently, the reason Jones's response to that sentence sealed the fate of 918 people, has nothing to do with what Jones said. It has everything to do with how the room responded to what Christine Miller said first. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand what Christine Miller said, and why it mattered, and why it ultimately didn't matter enough, you need to understand what the tape sounds like from the beginning. If you've ever wanted to understand not just what happened in Jonestown but how it was possible, how 918 people arrived at the same moment in the same place at the same time, subscribe right now and hit the bell. Because that is the only question this channel exists to answer. Not what. How. The recording begins in the middle of noise. Not chaos, noise. The sound of hundreds of people assembled in an outdoor pavilion at night, the jungle audible underneath everything, insects and distant birds, and the particular acoustic quality of open air and equatorial heat. Jones's voice comes in over a microphone, which means it is louder than everything else, which means it has the quality that amplified voices always have in large gatherings. The quality of inevitability, of something that fills all available space and leaves no room for an alternative. He is speaking, in those first minutes, about Congressman Leo Ryan. Ryan is dead. Jones says this plainly, without drama, the way you state a fact that everyone in the room already knows. The congressman came to Jonestown. The congressman tried to take people away. The congressman is now dead at the airstrip. And because the congressman is dead, Jones says, the world outside will come for them. The government will come. There will be no mercy and no negotiation. There is only one path left. He calls it, in those early minutes, a revolutionary act. Not suicide. Not death. A revolutionary act. A protest. The most powerful statement a community can make against a world that has tried to destroy it. He says they will die with dignity. He says they will die together. He says this is not the end but the beginning of something the world will be forced to reckon with. His voice is calm. Medicated calm, the kind that has a particular texture, slightly flattened at the edges, missing the peaks and valleys of natural speech, but still coherent, still organized, still building an argument with the structural logic of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times. Because he has rehearsed it. The White Night drills. The assemblies where residents were given cups and told the cups contain poison and then told the cups did not contain poison. This time it was only a test, this time it was only to see who was committed. Those drills were not practice for death. They were practice for this speech. For the moment when Jones would give this speech and the cups would not be empty. The sounds underneath his voice shift in those first minutes. You can hear people crying. Not screaming. Crying, the kind of crying that is quiet and resigned, the crying of people who have been told something they were already half prepared to hear. You can hear children, which is the hardest part of the recording for most people to listen to, the sound of children who do not fully understand what is happening but who can hear in the adults around them that something is ending. You can hear the vats being moved. The vats of purple liquid cyanide mixed with flavor aid and sedatives were large enough to require effort to position. You can hear that effort in the background. The logistics of what was about to happen, audible underneath the speech, underneath the crying, underneath the children, a sound like furniture being rearranged. And then, 11 minutes and some seconds in, Christine Miller speaks. She does not ask permission to speak. She does not wait to be called on. She simply raises her voice over the sound of the pavilion and says, in a tone that is neither hysterical nor submissive but something much harder to categorize, something that sounds, on the recording, like someone who has decided that if this is the last conversation she will ever have, she is going to have it honestly. She says, I think there are other alternatives. The room goes quieter. Not silent. quieter. Christine Miller was not a young woman. She was in her late 50s, a black woman who had been a member of People's Temple for years, who had given significant portions of her life and her resources to the community, who was by no account a troublemaker or a skeptic or someone who had been building toward this moment of resistance. She was, by every account of people who knew her, a true believer. Which is exactly why what she said next landed the way it did. She said, "I look at all the babies and I think they deserve to live." She said, "We all came here for freedom. We didn't come here for this." She said, "I feel that as long as there is life, there is hope." And then she said the sentence that almost no one quotes. The sentence that, 11 minutes into a 44-minute recording, represents the single clearest articulation of what was actually being decided in that pavilion, in language so plain and so direct that Jones could not answer it with ideology or rhetoric or revolutionary theory. She said, "What I'm saying is that we have a right to our own lives." The room did not cheer. The room did not go silent. What the room did, and this is audible on the recording, this is not interpretation but acoustic fact, is murmur. The murmur of hundreds of people processing something that had been said out loud that they had perhaps been thinking privately. The murmur of a community that had, for just a moment, heard one of its own members say the thing that fear and loyalty and the architecture of the previous decade had made almost impossible to say. Jones's response to Christine Miller has been analyzed and quoted and dissected extensively. He told her that death is not the enemy. He told her that he had been living with death for years. He told her that dying is not what he wanted, but it was the only option remaining. He spoke about the Soviet Union. Miller had suggested they could flee to Russia and dismissed it. He spoke about the suffering of their children, inverting Miller's argument about the babies with a logic so specific and so practiced that it was clearly not improvised. He said the children would suffer more if they lived, that the world outside would make their lives impossible, that a death now was a mercy compared to what the government would do to them. He was, in the purely technical sense of the word, persuasive. He had been persuasive for 30 years. Persuasion was the mechanism by which everything in that pavilion had come to exist. But here is what the analysis of Jones's response almost always misses. Here is the thing that is audible on the tape and almost never discussed. It is not what Jones said to Christine Miller that ended the conversation. It is what the crowd said. Because as Jones spoke, as he built his response to her argument, members of the congregation began to speak too, not in a coordinated way, not in the organized call and response of a rehearsed service, but spontaneously, the way a crowd speaks when it is processing something collectively, and some members are further along in that processing than others. And what some of those voices said, audible in the background underneath Jones's amplified speech, was directed not at Jones but at Christine Miller. They told her to stop. They told her she was wrong. They told her, in language that was not hostile but urgent, that it was too late, that Jones was right, that this was the only way. The crowd, in other words, did Jones's work for him. The community that Christine Miller had lived inside for years, the people she had worked beside and eaten beside and built something with, those people, in that moment, became the walls of the room she was trying to leave. This is the part of the 44-minute tape that researchers rarely linger on because it is the part that is hardest to absorb. Not the poison. Not the children. The crowd telling Christine Miller to stop. Because that sound. The sound of a community reflexively closing around dissent, not out of cruelty but out of the logic of collective survival that Jones had spent years engineering into the group's psychology. That sound is the sound of what a cult actually is, stripped of every dramatic element, reduced to its irreducible core. It is not a monster at the front of the room. It is the people in the room, who love each other, who have built something together, who cannot afford to let one person's doubt become everyone's doubt, because if it does, everything they have sacrificed to be here will have been for nothing. Christine Miller kept speaking for several more minutes. Jones kept responding. The exchange goes back and forth on the recording with a quality that is almost conversational, almost like a debate, almost like the kind of disagreement that gets resolved. It does not get resolved. At some point, Christine Miller's voice disappears from the recording. She does not storm out. She does not make a final statement. Her voice simply stops appearing, the way a voice stops when a person realizes that the conversation has already been decided by forces larger than the conversation itself. She died in Jonestown that night along with 917 other people. She was 53 years old. What happens after Christine Miller's voice disappears from the recording is the part most people know. The logistics become audible. Jones instructs the nurses to begin. There is the sound of people moving forward. There is the sound of children crying and then, in some cases, going quiet, which means the sedatives were working faster in smaller bodies. There is Jones's voice continuing to speak, the medicated flatness of it unchanged, narrating what is happening as it happens the way a pastor narrates a sacrament. Here is what this means, here is why this is sacred, here is what we are becoming by doing this. There are voices agreeing with him, affirming him, calling out in the language of the congregation. There are voices of people who are dying and saying things that are not coherent. There are long stretches where the primary sound is not voice at all but the ambient noise of the jungle and the pavilion and several hundred people in various stages of a process that Jones is still calling, in a voice that never raises and never breaks, a revolutionary act. The tape ends not with silence but with ambient sound. The jungle. The pavilion. Whatever the microphone was picking up in the absence of the voices. Investigators found the recorder still running when they arrived on November 19th. The batteries had not died. The tape had not run out. It had recorded everything there was to record and then continued recording the aftermath, the way a camera continues running after the subject has left the frame. 39 years after the recording was made, a researcher listening to it for the 40th or 50th time noticed something she had not noticed before. In the background, approximately 31 minutes in, underneath Jones's voice and the ambient noise of the pavilion, there is a sound she initially thought was microphone feedback. It was not feedback. It was a voice. A single voice, very low, at the edge of audibility. The researcher spent 3 days trying to isolate it. She recovered approximately half the words. What she recovered begins with I should have and ends with a phrase she transcribed as gone when she said it, a reference, she argued in the paper she published the following year, to Christine Miller. I should have gone when she said it. When Christine Miller stood up and said we have a right to our own lives, someone in that pavilion thought exactly that. Thought it at a register too low to be heard, 11 minutes too late. We do not know who that voice belonged to. We do not know if the transcription is correct. The fragment is disputed among scholars who study the Jonestown recordings. Some believe it is ambient noise misread as language, some believe it is exactly what the researcher said it was. The dispute has never been resolved. The recording quality is insufficient. It exists in the permanent ambiguity that certain historical evidence exists in. Close enough to meaning something to be impossible to dismiss, too damaged to confirm. But here is what is not ambiguous. Here is what the 44-minute tape contains that is clear and uncontested and almost never discussed in the same breath as Christine Miller's name. 11 minutes in, one person said we have a right to our own lives. The room murmured. The crowd pushed back. The conversation continued for several more minutes and then Christine Miller's voice disappeared and the process continued and 918 people died. And somewhere in the 31st minute, at a volume too low to be intended as communication, possibly at a volume the speaker did not know was audible at all, someone said I should have gone when she said it. That is the sentence almost no one quotes. Not because it is not there, but because of what it means that it was said at that volume, at that minute, in that place. It means that Christine Miller's words landed. It means that somewhere in that pavilion, in someone, the argument worked. It means that the crowd pushing back and Jones's amplified response and the architecture of a decade of community and sacrifice and loyalty. All of it was not enough to prevent at least one person from hearing Christine Miller say we have a right to our own lives and thinking, privately, irreversibly, yes. It was just not enough to make that person stand up and say it out loud 11 minutes earlier, when it might have meant something. When it might have changed the temperature of the room. When it might have made the murmur louder. When Christine Miller might not have been speaking alone. That is what the tape contains. That is what 44 minutes sounds like when you listen to all of it, including the parts that are hardest to hear. Not a madman and his followers. A community, and one woman inside it who said the true thing at the right moment, and a room that was not yet ready to hear it, and somewhere in the 31st minute, when it was far too late, a voice that had finally gotten there. There is a version of the Jonestown story that is easy to tell. A charismatic man with dark glasses built a following, moved them to the jungle, and killed them. The story is true in its facts and almost completely wrong in its implications, because it locates the horror in one man and makes it manageable, something that requires a specific kind of monster to create. The 44-minute tape is the argument against that version. Because what the tape documents is not a monster giving orders. It is a community making a decision. A community that had been built, over years, into a structure where that decision was possible. Where belonging and loyalty and shared sacrifice had been engineered into something that could close around dissent the way a hand closes around a bird, not with malice, but with the reflexive force of a thing that has been taught, over a very long time, that its survival depends on staying closed. Jones understood this long before he built People's Temple. The most durable form of control is not external, not guards, not walls, not threats, but internal. The kind that lives inside the people being controlled and that they experience not as control but as belonging. The kind that makes Christine Miller, standing up in that pavilion, feel not like a revolutionary but like a problem. The kind that makes the crowd push back not because Jones instructed them to but because they genuinely believe she is wrong. Because the alternative, that she is right, that they have a right to their own lives, is a thought so threatening to everything they have built that it cannot be examined without the whole architecture shaking. This is what cults are. Not aberrations. Not the products of unusual monsters. Highly refined versions of something that exists in every human community. In every group of people who have built something together and developed, in the process, a shared investment in its continuation. The difference between a community and a cult is not the presence of belonging or loyalty. The difference is whether the community has built a mechanism for hearing Christine Miller. A structure that can hold her words without collapsing. A way of saying we have a right to our own lives that does not require a woman to say it alone, at a microphone, in the 31st minute of a 44-minute tape. The researcher who found the disputed voice published her paper in 2017. She titled it with a question, what would it have taken? The paper did not answer definitively, it was not that kind of paper. But in its conclusion she wrote something that has stayed with every person who has read it. She wrote, "The voice in the 31st minute is the most important voice on the recording. Not because we know whose it was, but because it proves that Christine Miller did not speak into silence. She spoke into a room full of people who were listening, some of whom understood, and most of whom were not yet ready to say so out loud. The tragedy of Jonestown is not that no one heard her. The tragedy is the distance between hearing and speaking. That distance, in a community built the way People's Temple was built, had become uncrossable. But it was not always uncrossable. There was a time years before, in Indianapolis, in San Francisco, before the architecture was complete, when that distance was small enough that a person who heard the true thing could say it without becoming Christine Miller. The tape documents the end of the story. What it cannot document, because it begins too late, is all the moments before the end when the story could have gone another way. When the distance was still crossable. When the room was still capable of answering.